The sun scorched the cracked earth of the frontier town of Rattlesnake Hollow, but that didn't stop the entire settlement from gathering at the train station. Dressed in their Sunday best for what had been promised as the most extravagant wedding west of the Mississippi, Elijah McGraw, the wealthiest cattle baron in 5 territories, had spared no expense. Gold-trimmed carriages, imported lace, a preacher from the city, and a custom piano brought in by ox carted was to be the event that sealed his dynasty. His bride, Clara Belle Harwood, had grown up in that town, known for her quiet grace and unshakable loyalty. Though not adorned in glamour, she carried herself like someone who had built something strong from dust and hardship. As she stepped from the station platform in her modest yet lovely gown, holding her late mother's hand-stitched bouquet, murmurs of admiration passed through the crowd. The preacher cleared his throat. The pianist struck a chord. Elijah stood tall in a new black duster and ivory Stetson, the picture of confidence and ambition, and then the train whistle blew. As steam hissed and iron wheels groaned, a new figure emerged from the passenger car, a woman in crimson satin, her lips like fire, her eyes hidden beneath a parasol too fine for desert winds. No one knew her name, but she didn't need one. Clara Belle reached for his hand. Elijah pulled away. A hush fell, as if the entire desert had stopped breathing. "I can't do this," he said loudly enough for the crowd to hear. "I've found something better." Gasps rose like gunfire. The preacher dropped his Bible. Clara didn't cry, froze, her eyes wide, her face draining of color. Then Elijah, without a glance back, offered his arm to the stranger and walked off the platform like he hadn't just set his own life on fire. The crowd parted as he passed, stunned into silence. Some people whispered prayers. Others turned away in disgust. Clara stood alone, bouquet trembling in her hands, her veil catching in the wind like a ghost refusing to settle. A child cried. A drunk laughed nervously. The pianist, unsure what else to do, played the last note and closed the lid. Elijah's father looked like he'd swallowed gunpowder. His mother sat down on the bench and fainted. The townsfolk began to murmur not about the red-dressed stranger, but about the shame, the disrespect, the reckoning sure to come. A wedding meant to unite 2 powerful families had become a public humiliation, a social fracture, and an irreversible decision carried out under the eyes of every soul for 50 miles. That night, Clara didn't return to her family's home. She stayed in the small room above the dressmaker's shop, curled in silence. She didn't speak for 3 days. On the 4th day, she rode out alone to the hills where the Harwood cattle grazed, and never once looked back at town. Meanwhile, Elijah and the stranger, whose name turned out to be Lucinda Ravel, left in his carriage for his sprawling estate, laughing like 2 villains at the end of a play. No one congratulated them. No one clapped. And no one, absolutely no one, forgot. It became the talk of neighboring towns, the shame of Rattlesnake Hollow, and the beginning of a story far crueler than anyone could have imagined. Because when you reject love in the name of lust, under the burning eye of a town that built you, the desert always remembers, and it always gets even. Lucinda Ravel arrived in Rattlesnake Hollow like a thunderstorm wearing perfume. Her crimson dress shimmered like sin in the sunlight, and her words fell like honey-coated knives. Elijah McGraw had never seen anything like herseltree, brazen, laughing in the face of propriety. To him, she was a revelation, a symbol of the world beyond dirt roads and cattle herds. They rode away from Clara's ruined wedding as though they were heroes in a dime novel, never looking back at the wreckage they left behind. For the first few weeks, Elijah was drunk on her exotic perfume, her city talk, her shameless appetite for the finer things. She drank wine instead of whiskey, read novels in the parlor, and mocked the town's values with a sneer and a toss of her curls. At first, Elijah thought her boldness was charm. He didn't notice that the servants began quitting one by one. He didn't notice how she would wander through Clara's old rooms and burn what she didn't like: letters, quilts, portraits, until the house no longer remembered its past. What Elijah also failed to see was the ledger she kept under lock and key. Lucinda never touched her own inheritance because there was none. Her expensive tastes were financed by Elijah's fortune, and her sudden interest in ranch operations had less to do with ranching and more to do with rewriting the deed. At night, when Elijah slept like a king beside his jewel, She sat by candlelight writing letters sealed with wax and sent to towns he didn't know. She asked questions of his foreman, dismissed staff loyal to the McGraws, and began inviting strangers into the home. Old friends, she called them. But they carried pistols and wore silk-lined boots, and their eyes measured walls like buyers, not visitors. Elijah brushed it off. Lucinda, he told himself, was simply more sophisticated. She came from a place of parties and risk, where men knew how to win and women knew how to bend them. But even the ranch hands started whispering, "She ain't what she seems," they'd mutter over campfires. A rattler in velvet. Then came the investments. Lucinda convinced Elijah to purchase new land, open a mine in Dead Man's Gulch, start a gambling hall in a neighboring town. At first, the venture seemed promising. But profits never arrived, and debts began to stack like bodies in a saloon brawl. Elijah signed contracts without reading them. He stopped riding the fences. He stopped caring about cattle, water rights, or the land itself. He dressed finer than ever, but he didn't look like a rancher anymore. He looked like a man trying not to drown in gold that wasn't his. Clara had once helped him build his fortune. Lucinda helped him spend it. The breaking point came one night during a gala. Lucinda threw at the estate-imported champagne, a live orchestra, guests in masquerade. Elijah, grinning beneath a golden mask, toasted her with pride. Then as the crowd danced, he overheard her on the veranda whispering to a stranger, her voice low but sharp as glass, "He's almost bled dry. Then we leave. I don't do long winters." Elijah froze. Something inside him cracked, not like a whip but like a bone snapping clean. The stranger one of her old friends noticed him and offered a tight smile before slipping back inside. Elijah stood there in the cold for a long time, staring at the woman he'd humiliated Clara for. The next morning, Lucinda was gone. So was the jewelry, so were the documents, so was the safe's gold. She left behind only a note that read, "You wanted a dream, I was just your lesson." The townspeople didn't gloat. They didn't have to. Elijah's name became a bitter punchline in card games and prayers. He rode into town 1 week later looking 10 years older, his hat in his hands, and asked the barkeep if he'd seen Clara. The man just nodded toward the hills and said, "She don't need you now, and she sure don't miss you." It was only then that Elijah realized what he'd done. Not just to Clara, but to himself. He hadn't traded love for love. He'd traded loyalty for lust, respect for ridicule, and a future for a fantasy. And the West has never been kind to fools who forget where their strength comes from. While Elijah McGraw's estate crumbled beneath the weight of betrayal and debt, Clara Belle Harwood vanished into the hills, into the highlands of her family's neglected pasture, far from town gossip and poisoned memories. But her disappearance wasn't a retreat. It was the beginning of a transformation no one, least of all Elijah, ever imagined. The Harwood Ranch, once modest and half-forgotten, became her sanctuary and her proving ground. In the weeks after the failed wedding, Clara worked sunup to sundown, mending fences, hauling water, learning to rope and brand. Her fingers blistered, her arms grew strong. Her voice, once delicate, rang across the hills like a rifle shot. The cattle ranchers nearby watched in silence. They'd seen women fall apart for less, but Clara did not fall apart. She built something. She started with just a dozen head of cattle left to her by her late father. By season's end, she'd doubled them, then tripled. Word spread that she was smarter than most men in the trade, quick with numbers, sharper with deals, and tougher than the winter frost. One by one, neighbors came offering land leases, cattle swaps, partnerships. She accepted some, turned others away with a smile that carried steel behind it. No one ever dared mention Elijah's name. Those who did found themselves swiftly uninvited. She began hosting Sunday dinners under the stars for cowhands, travelers, and young widows looking to rebuild. Her kindness was quiet but unshakable, her presence commanding but never cruel. Then came the newspapers. The Denver Chronicle ran a story titled, "The Harwood Phoenix, Woman Rancher Turns Ruin into Empire." Reporters came sniffing, hoping for drama. Clara gave them hard facts, soft eyes, and no scandal. She refused to speak Elijah's name even once. "That chapter is closed," she told one journalist. "I'm too busy writing new ones." When the paper published her portrait, dust on her boots, a leather hat in her hand, and the sun behind her like a halo, letters from suitors flooded the post office. She ignored them. Instead, she hired 3 more ranch hands, bought adjoining property, and built a schoolhouse on the edge of her land for children too far from town. She had no need to prove her worth, but she did anyway through grit, grace, and relentless forward motion. Back in Rattlesnake Hollow, the townsfolk began talking, not with pity but with pride. Women pointed to Clara as the example for their daughters. Men tipped their hats and said "ma'am" with real reverence. The mayor asked her to run for the town council. She declined. She wasn't interested in politics. Her power was quiet, rooted in the earth, in the cattle, in the iron will that had carried her through public humiliation and into local legend. Even Elijah's former allies, bankers, ranchers, and old family friends started drifting toward Clara's side. She never gloated, never claimed revenge. But one by one, the very pillars of Elijah's old empire became part of hers. One evening, as the sky burned orange over the plains, Clara stood on her porch, sipping strong coffee, her boots muddy from a day in the fields. Beside her was a young girl she'd taken in from a family that hadn't survived the last harsh winter. The girl asked, "Miss Clara, how come you never got married?" Clara smiled, her eyes distant. "Because I ain't done building yet," she said. But inside, the truth beat steadier. She no longer measured her life by who stood beside her but by what she had survived and what she had grown. And then, as if fate couldn't help but twist the knife, Elijah returned to town, weathered, broke, and riding a borrowed horse. He spotted Clara across the square one morning, surrounded by ranchers asking her opinion on grazing rights. She didn't look his way, didn't pause, didn't flinch. And that moment, silent and cold as a pistol cocking, cut deeper than any insult. He realized then, he hadn't just lost her. He'd lost the version of her that once needed him. The woman he left at the train station was gone. The one who stood before him now didn't even remember how to need him, and that was a wound he would never stop bleeding from. The McGraw name once carried weight like a judge's gavel, feared, respected, rarely questioned. But in the wake of Elijah's betrayal and Lucinda's vanishing act, that legacy began to rot from the inside. His family, long considered royalty in Rattlesnake Hollow, found themselves standing ankle-deep in the mud of scandal. It started with silence, letters unanswered, invitations ignored. Then came the whispers. The McGraw matriarch, Eleanor, was seen less and less in church. When she did appear, her hat sat lower on her brow and her smiles came out stiff, like they'd been ironed onto her face. She didn't speak of Elijah, not to neighbors, not to the pastor, not even to her bridge club. His father, Judge Horace McGraw, was harder to read, but even he stopped defending his son. A man who once bragged of Elijah's cunning now sat on his porch with a bottle of rye and a 1,000-yard stare, mumbling about honor and how quickly men forget their blood. It didn't take long for the wider community to withdraw. Ranchers who once partnered with the McGraw herd pulled out of deals. The bank, spooked by rumors of missing gold and Lucinda's involvement in fraudulent land grants, froze several accounts. Even the sheriff, who used to tip his hat to Elijah like clockwork, now crossed the street when he saw him coming. He wore his best coats, polished his boots, tried to smile through the judgment. But the town had a long memory, and pride doesn't rebuild burned bridges. The real breaking point came at the annual Founders' Bala celebration of the original settlers, hosted in the town hall every autumn. Elijah, desperate to reclaim a shred of dignity, arrived alone in an old, slightly frayed tuxedo. Eyes followed him like wolves tracking a wounded buck. The orchestra paused when he stepped inside. People whispered. Some turned away, others didn't bother hiding their disgust. Across the room, Clara Bell stood surrounded by ranchers and merchants, laughing lightly, a glass of bourbon in hand. She wore a midnight blue dress stitched from her own ranch's Katona, quiet triumph, not a shout. Elijah approached her, not close, just enough for her to feel the heat of his shame. She looked through him as if he were wind against the window. He turned back, his jaw clenched, but even the bartender poured his drink without making eye contact. From that night on, Elijah stopped attending public events. He rarely visited town except to pick up supplies alone, unshaven, and quieter than anyone had ever known him to be. He returned to the remains of his estate, which now echoed with emptiness. His foreman quit. The stable boy left. He tried to write to Lucinda 5 letters over 2 months. None returned. Worse, a Pinkerton man showed up asking questions about her, claiming she had swindled men in 3 states and vanished with a baron's dowry just weeks before meeting Elijah. When the man left, Elijah didn't speak for a day. He just sat by the fireplace, watching the flames devour wood the way his choices had devoured everything else. Then came the visit from his younger sister, Molly. She rode in without a word and sat him down in the parlor they used to sneak cookies from as children. "You didn't just break her heart," she said, voice trembling. "You broke our name. You took a woman who would have died for you and crushed her for a shadow in red silk." Elijah tried to speak, but she raised a hand. "We've lost land, reputation, and any hope of rebuilding unless you make it right. But it's too late for that, isn't it?" She left him with nothing but silence, and the closing of a front door that sounded more like a coffin lid. Neighbors started calling the old McGraw estate the Hollow House. Children dared each other to sneak to the gates. Old friends pretended they'd never known him. The preacher no longer sent letters. No one brought by pies. The world moved on, and the man who once stood tallest now found himself smaller than the dust that clung to his boots. There was no outcry, no mob, no pitchforks. Just the slow erosion of every bond he'd once taken for granted. And in the quiet of his own making, Elijah began to understand that the worst punishment wasn't loneliness, it was the memory of what he'd had, and the knowledge that it would never be his again. As Elijah McGraw drifted further into the shadow of his former life, Clarabelle Harwood's star only rose higher. With every acre she acquired and every deal she brokered, her name carved deeper into the backbone of the frontier. The woman once humiliated on a train platform had become a living legend, her influence stretching from cattle trails to state lines. But it wasn't just land and cattle that marked her rise. It was the way people looked at her now, with admiration, yes, but something more. They looked at her the way folks looked at sunrise after surviving a storm. She had become more than a rancher. She had become a symbol, and that, more than anything else, began to unravel Elijah from the inside. He first heard the rumors at the general store, whispers between sacks of flour and rifle polish, that Clara was being courted by a wealthy northern investor, that he was young, principled, and charming, that he rode a black gelding and brought her books and bourbon. Elijah laughed bitterly at first, called it town gossip, but then he saw it with his own eyes. One morning, passing through town for supplies, Elijah spotted Clara riding beside a man he didn't recognize. The stranger had a jaw like a sculptor's chisel and hands that clearly hadn't spent years shoveling manure. Yet there he was, tipping his hat, smiling at Clara like she was a sunrise. "And Clara?" She laughed, freely. The kind of laugh Elijah hadn't heard from her since before the wedding. That laugh haunted him. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't guarded. It was real. It was joy. A joy that hadn't included him in a very long time. He went home that night and stared at the mirror, tracing the lines in his face that hadn't been there a year ago. Clara, it seemed, had shed her scars, but his had only grown deeper. Word came soon after that the stranger's name was Nathaniel Arcara, former military officer turned railroad magnate, a man with both money and honor. He'd survived a skirmish in the Dakota Territories and walked away with medals and stories of bravery. Women swooned, men respected him. Elijah seethed. What made it worse was that Nathaniel wasn't some charlatan or smooth-talking swindler. He respected Clara, treated her like an equal. He didn't try to tame her, Spirith admired it. They were often seen discussing land grants, trail rights, even building a telegraph station near her property. She hadn't just moved on, she'd upgraded. Elijah, from the confines of his once proud estate, began tracking their movements like a hunter in the dark. He sent riders to town for newspapers, paid a drifter to eavesdrop during market days. The more he learned, the more it twisted inside him. Nathaniel had even spoken in church one Sunday about building a future on faith and integrity, the same church Elijah hadn't dared show his face in for months. The final blow came in the form of an invitation. delivered not to Elijah but accidentally handed to one of his hands who had no idea who he was working for. It was an invitation to a spring harvest celebration hosted by Clara, herself, open to ranchers, settlers, and merchants across 3 counties. The invitation, printed on thick parchment, bore Clara's new ranch seal and Nathaniel's signature beside it. To honor partnership and growth. Elijah stared at it like it was a death notice. Not because it signified a party, but because it symbolized the final nail in the coffin of any illusion he had left. Clara Bell wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, and not quietly. She was building a legacy in the open, in the daylight, and with a man who actually deserved her. He didn't go to the party, couldn't, but he sent a letter, 4 pages long, rambling, desperate, not asking for forgiveness but trying to explain. He spoke of pressure, of how Lucinda had deceived him, how he'd lost himself chasing something he thought was sophistication, how he had once loved Clara truly. The letter never received a reply. Weeks later, a friend of his in town said he saw it, unopened, tossed into the fireplace at the dressmaker's where Clara occasionally visited. She hadn't even read it. She hadn't needed to. That silence hit harder than any insult. Now, when Elijah passed through town, he did so like a ghost. People spoke around him, not to him. He could still see her name etched into the ledger at the bank. Her ranch, now expanded to triple its original size, had become the central supplier for most of the territory. She'd even begun funding a boarding school for orphan children, a project Nathaniel promised to match with a second location near the river basin. Elijah watched from afar as Clara Bell built not just a new life, but a new world. And every hammer strike, every legal document signed, every child that smiled on her land felt like thunder in Elijah's hollow chest. It was one thing to lose the woman. It was another to realize he'd never again stand where she stood. She was no longer the girl he left behind. She was the future, and he, no matter how long he lived, would always be stuck in the past. As the world around Elijah McGraw grew richer, louder, and more full of life, his own shrank into a slow, suffocating silence. The once proud cattle baron, who had commanded respect with a glance, now lived in a crumbling estate stripped of its laughter, its legacy, and most of all its purpose. The horses were gone, sold off one by one to cover debts. The fields had dried, the fences sagged like broken promises. Only the wind moved with any conviction across the dust-bitten property. The grand house that had once hosted dignitaries and dancers now echoed with creaking floorboards and bitter memories. Elijah tried to fight back at first. He tried schemes, low partnerships with shady land agents, a failed silver mine venture that bankrupted 3 others, and an ill-advised poker game where he lost the last family heirloom, his mother's gold locket. Every step toward salvation became a stumble deeper into disgrace. The few remaining ranch hands he trusted left after unpaid wages and a fire that destroyed half the barn. By then, his estate wasn't a home, it was a prison, a mausoleum filled with ghosts. He walked those long hallways like a man trying to remember who he used to be, touching old photographs with fingers that shook too much to grasp a glass steady anymore. Visitors stopped coming entirely. Even the telegraph operator in town stopped forwarding messages to the McGraw estate. There were none to send. Elijah's name was no longer spoken in public unless it was part of a cautionary tale. "You want to end up like McGraw?" they'd say to wide-eyed ranch boys too eager to chase dreams without thinking. The irony cut deepest when Clara's name came up, always with pride, reverence, admiration. "Miss Harwood did it right," they'd say. "Built from the ashes. Built with her own damn hands." And then they'd add, almost like a footnote, "And McGraw? He traded her for silk and ended up with dust." As winter set in, Elijah's health began to betray him. The cold settled in his joints like old guilt, and the once hearty meals of roasted elk and wild herbs turned into stale bread and canned beans. He kept a flask on him at all times, but even whiskey couldn't dull the sharp sting of hindsight. His reflection became a stranger sunken eyes, gray streaks in his once golden hair, a permanent furrow between his brows, as if his own soul had drawn a line through him. The mirror in the grand hall cracked during a storm, and he never replaced it. He said it was an accident, but truthfully, he couldn't bear to look at himself anymore. One morning, After a particularly cold night, he walked to the edge of his property where the fence had long since fallen and stared out at the hills where Clara once rode. He stood there for hours, hoping maybe for a glimpse, maybe for a memory. Instead, he saw nothing but empty prairie. That was when the hallucinations began. A voice in the hallway. A soft laugh on the wind, the scent of Lucinda's perfume wafting down the stairs, but no one was ever there. His mind, like his fortune, had begun to splinter. And yet, through it all, the one memory that haunted him most wasn't Lucinda. It was Clara. Clara on the platform, Clara in white lace, Clara reaching for his hand and him pulling away. That moment looped endlessly. A living punishment in a broken man's theater. By spring, the estate was little more than a haunted relic. Vines had overtaken the garden, the paint peeled like shedding skin. Locals claimed to hear piano music at night, though no one played anymore. One brave Sula boy delivering feed for a neighbor approached once, and found Elijah sitting alone on the porch, wrapped in a blanket too thin for the wind. "Do you want me to send word to someone?" the boy asked, eyes wide with pity. Elijah didn't answer, just waved him off and muttered something about ghosts being better company. The final blow came when the bank sent notice of foreclosure. Not because Clara had interfered, she hadn't lifted a finger against him, but because Elijah had run out of chances. He watched as the estate was auctioned off to a young couple from the north, eager to start a new life. They didn't know the history, they didn't care. To them, it was land, soil, a place for dreams. Elijah didn't attend the auction. He packed what little he had, an old pocket watch, a few letters from better times, and the hat his father gave him when he was 18 and left under cover of dusk. No one knows exactly where he went. Some say he wandered east toward the mountains. Others claim he became a drifter, seen in border towns muttering to himself, asking bartenders if they'd ever heard of a woman named Clara. What is known is that Elijah McGraw died alone, no obituary, no family vigil, just a cold wind and a name remembered only in the footnotes of someone else's triumph. His legacy wasn't carved into stone, it was whispered into caution. And Clara? She never spoke of him again, never needed to, because the world had already written the story and it knew who the real survivor was. Years passed like dust blowing across the open plainsolent, relentless, and full of change. Rattlesnake Hollow was no longer a rough frontier outpost but a thriving township, complete with a schoolhouse, a telegraph line, and a railway extension funded in part by Clara Belle Harwood herself. Her ranch had grown into the largest in the territory, and her influence reached beyond cattle and land. She was a patron of the arts, a sponsor of education, and a quiet force in the regional council. Her name was spoken with warmth and reverence from Dead Man's Gulch to the Missouri River. By now, Clara was no longer merely admired, she was beloved. And beside her stood Nathaniel Archer, no longer just a suitor but a steadfast partner, soon to be her husband. The wedding was set for autumn, a tasteful affair, not opulent, but elegant in a way that only a woman like Clara could manifest. It would be held on her ranch, beneath the old oak tree she had once climbed as a girl. Invitations were sent across the territories. Carpenters built a wooden platform near the pasture, and flowers from the highlands were arranged along the path leading to the altar. The guest list included governors, ranchers, teachers, and orphans Clara had raised like her own kin. But one name was not on that list: Elijah McGraw. And yet, word of the wedding reached him. He had returned to Rattlesnake Hollow under a new name, barely recognizable. His coat was ragged, his beard wild, and his boots so worn the soles flapped with every step. Locals passed him without a glance. He slept behind the abandoned telegraph office and worked odd jobs for a few coin shoveling manure, sweeping saloons, hauling water. He spoke rarely and never mentioned his past. But someone eventually recognized the eyes, the same ones that once looked down from the McGraw estate's balcony like a prince surveying his kingdom. When he heard about Clara's wedding, something inside him shifted. Not hope, not fury, something deeper, raw and clawing, like an unfinished sentence echoing in his chest. He didn't want to ruin her day. He didn't want to stop the wedding. He just wanted to say something, to explain, to be heard, to ask, even if silently, whether she'd ever once looked back the way he had 1,000 times. So, on the morning of her wedding, Elijah dressed in the best clothes he had, which wasn't much: a patched coat, a clean shirt, and the battered Stetson that had survived his rise and fall. He didn't ride a horse. He walked. The celebration was already in motion when he arrived. Musicians strummed under the shade. Children ran barefoot in the fields. The scent of roasted meat and wildflowers hung in the air. Elijah stood at the edge of the crowd, just outside the fence line, unseen but watching. Then, as Clara stepped out of the house dressed not in white lace, but a deep, earth-toned gown that shimmered like the land she had conquered, he stepped forward, 1 foot over the fence rail. 1 step onto the soil she now ruled. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Some recognized him immediately. Others simply felt the tension tighten like a lasso. Nathaniel, ever the sentinel, moved swiftly to Clara's side. She didn't flinch. She didn't frown. She simply looked at Elijah the way a mountain looks at rain, unmoved, unchanged. He removed his hat. "Miss Harwood," he said, his voice hoarse but clear, "I came to say I was wrong." Clara didn't blink. The wind tugged at her gown. "You already said that," she replied, calm as steel. "With your actions. Years ago." Elijah swallowed. "I didn't know what I had." She nodded once. "And now you do. That's the price." He stepped closer, his eyes desperate, searching for the woman he once humiliated. "I lost everything," he murmured. Clara's gaze didn't waver. "No," she said. "You threw it away. There's a difference." A silence fell over the field. Elijah looked at Nathaniel, then at the altar, then back at Clara. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "But I had to look you in the eyes and say it." She studied him, not with hatred or even pity, but with the cold clarity of someone who had carried a burden long enough to forget its weight. "You are looking at me," she said. "But you're not seeing me. That girl you left is gone. I buried her years ago. And this woman," she glanced at Nathaniel, her hand slipping easily into his. "This woman doesn't need closure from a man who mistook lust for love." Elijah's mouth parted slightly, but there was nothing left to say. No argument, no tearful plea, no speech that could undo what had been scorched into time. He bowed his head, placed his hat back on, and turned. Not hurried, not ashamed, just hollow. As he disappeared over the hill, the music began again. Clara stepped forward, walking down the aisle, not as a bride, but as a queen in her own right. When she reached the altar, she smiled not because of Elijah's return, but because it no longer had any power over her. And in the days that followed, Elijah vanished from Rattlesnake Hollow once more. Some say he died that winter, frozen beneath a grove of trees outside town. Others believe he wandered far north, living among fur traders, telling stories of a woman he once knew but never truly saw. No grave bears his name, no tale redeems him. But in the hearts of those who knew the truth, he lives as a Warninga man who had everything, lost it all, and arrived too late at the gates of redemption. Clara's wedding went on, and when she kissed Nathaniel beneath the branches of that old oak, the whole town cheered not just for love, but for the woman who had turned pain into power and silence into legend.